Well, I'm a little concerned about it. First of all, I think, I don't know of anyone who doesn't want to see taxes held in abeyance a little bit, because New York State is highly taxed. There's no doubt about it, and I think we would all agree with that. But I'm not so sure this tax cap, as it has been legislated, is the way to go. Certainly it's got some qualities to it that is attractive to the public. I think the public out there is going to believe that actually districts are going to come out with 2% or lower levies and ask voters to approve those. But that's going to be a struggle for many school districts. If you're very wealthy, you have huge amounts of reserves, and you've already positioned yourself for a tax cap, you're probably going to be in good shape. Matter of fact, I've noticed a lot of wealthy districts had large tax levy increases last year. So therefore, that kind of puts them at a new higher base for a tax cap, which makes it easier to absorb. By contrast, low wealth districts were already struggling, and they have really small levy increases last year. Some are maybe around 2% or 3%, but we see a lot of wealthy districts even higher, 4 or 5%. So poor districts are not positioned well for this. Additionally, poor districts have used significant amount of reserves already, just surviving to this point, and have jettisoned a number of employees. So let's talk about the tax cap and how it works. Well, what I've got to actually do is I've got to go through a computation to see if I actually can come up with a 2% increase in my levy. But don't forget, the levy is based on state aid that is problematic, as well as their budget. But it's also predicated on two other parts. Part of our school district is now, many school districts are being supplanted by federal money that has kept people employed, and that money's going away at the end of the year. So I think you're going to find a large number of districts already facing a little bit of a budget deficit. In other words, they won't have revenues to sustain their current budget going forward. Costs are going to escalate. We've got Triborough Amendment, which is going to guarantee any step raises, okay? We've got negotiated contracts to work. Many of them were negotiated when the legislature and governor promised to expand state aid over a 4-year period. And now they have these contracts, but state aid didn't show up. So now they're stuck with them. Try and negotiate many of them. We also have escalating costs in pension, which the school district has no control over, nor do teachers. They cannot negotiate it away, and it's not like they asked for it personally or anything like that. But the truth of it is these costs are escalating rapidly into double digits, high double digits, 20, 30%. And so we also have medical costs increasing. Gas is increasing. Equipment is increasing. The CPI is over 3%. We're starting to see it in bus equipment and maintenance and all types of things. So school districts are going to be hard pressed. So the average wealth and poor districts are going to be very hard pressed because they have minimal reserves at this point. To get to the 2% tax cap, what they're going to have to do is, if they don't want to eliminate any more staff, they're going to have to jump to any reserves or any extra money they have left over to actually mute the impact of these escalating costs. Because remember, when the tax cap was passed, it was supposed to be passed with mandate relief. Well, the mandate relief that's come out so far is marginal at best and has very little impact on the school district's budget. It's like a great soundbite, but there's really no big result there. So what's actually going to happen is they've got to find a way to mute this. So they're going to have to run to their reserves or cash that they have on hand. And therefore, there will be more cash strapped and eliminate these reserves. So I look at it this way. Let's just say, for instance, half of your budget is people, which is normal in education because we have very little equipment. It's people working with people. And all those people were required to get a 2% raise based on the current education law under the Triborough Amendment. That would mean that your budget must increase by 1% at least, just to cover the salaries. Now, if you take a look at it mathematically, then you say, okay, if that's the amount my budget can increase is 1%, what would be the tax levy I'd have to raise my budget 1%? If it's 3 or 4%, you won't be able to do it. Because if 1% of your budget is greater than 2% of your levy, you won't be able to meet the tax cap. So you're going to have to find other money to offset and bring in more revenues. But there's another factor. This gets very complicated. These districts, over the last few years, to save their budgets and to minimize the amount of staff cuts, have increased a fund called appropriated fund balance. This is the amount of money they've taken out of their reserves to simply offset a tax increase. Let's just say it's $650,000. Well, now, every year, forever, unless other revenue shows up or some savings occurs someplace, they will have to come up with the $650,000. Where does this money usually come from? Sometimes a reserve, But more often than not, it comes from the savings between what was anticipated to be your expenses and revenues versus what actually turned out to be your revenues and expenditures. Because a budget is a spending plan based on anticipated revenues. And you always want to make sure you're going to have enough money to make the budget work. So sometimes you have a couple dollars left over, and you can use that to reduce taxes. But as these budgets get tighter and tighter over the last few years to make them work, the ability to generate that difference is starting to be a mirage. It's starting to go away. So we're being hard pressed to come up with that appropriated fund balance year after year after year. But the problem is, of course, in the last couple of years, that amount of money has accelerated rapidly as we've stolen money out of our reserves and actually put it into this appropriated fund balance to mute the tax impact. So we have all these things working at the same time. The loss of the federal money, escalating costs, loss of reserves and the ability to bring back my appropriated fund balance. Basically flat state aid, and in some cases state aid cuts that are detrimental. So I think what districts are going to be is hard pressed, especially if they're average wealth to below average wealth districts, to come up with the 2%.